The school principal called me into her office and told me my son had been telling his classmates that his dad was in love. I laughed it off. I told her kids say things. But then she slid a piece of paper across her desk, and I stopped breathing entirely. If this story touches you, please subscribe, hit that like button, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. I want to tell you something about the kind of man I was before any of this happened. I was a man who kept everything in neat rows. Lunches packed the night before. Permission slips signed before the ink was dry. Coffee brewed at exactly 6:15 every morning, because that was the only thing I could count on to be the same from one day to the next. I was predictable in the way that people who have survived a lot of unpredictability tend to be. Order felt like safety. Routine felt like love, and I told myself that was enough. My name is Ade Okonkwo. I was 41 years old, living in Raleigh, North Carolina, in a neighborhood called Boylan Heights, where the streets are lined with craftsman bungalows and old oak trees that look like they have been standing since before anyone alive can remember. My house was the one with the dark green shutters and the mailbox shaped like a bass clef, which my son Kobai had picked out himself when he was 6 years old, and which I had never had the heart to replace even though it leaned slightly to the left now, and the paint had started to fade. Kobai was 9. He had his mother's eyes and my stubbornness and a laugh that could fill a whole room. He also had a talent for saying exactly the wrong thing at exactly the right moment, which I mean in the most affectionate possible way. He was one of those kids who didn't quite understand that some things are private, not because he was careless, but because he genuinely believed that anything true was worth saying out loud. His mother, Yuan, and I had separated 3 years earlier. We had been together since college, married for 8 years, and the end of our marriage was not dramatic. There was no single moment of betrayal, no catastrophic argument that broke everything beyond repair. There was just a slow, quiet realization, arrived at honestly on both sides, that we had built a life together that was good but not the right shape for either of us. Yuan had known things about herself that she hadn't had language for when we were young. So had I, if I am being completely honest, which is the only way I know how to tell this story. We figured it out together, we cried, we grieved what we had built, and then we chose to be kind to each other, which was the hardest and most important choice we ever made. Kobai had 2 homes. He had parents who still ate dinner together on Sunday evenings and who meant it when they said they were friends. I am proud of that. I am proud of us. But here is what I had not done in the 3 years since my marriage ended. I had not let anyone in. I had gone on a few dates, very few, mostly arranged by well-meaning friends who thought I needed to be fixed in some way. None of those evenings had gone anywhere, and I had not tried very hard to make them. I told myself I was protecting Kobai. I told myself I was still settling. The truth was simpler and more uncomfortable than that. The truth was that I had spent most of my adult life living slightly to the side of who I actually was, and I did not yet know how to live any other way. I had known I was gay since I was about 17. I had loved Yuan genuinely and deeply, but that love existed alongside something else, something I had folded up very small and placed somewhere dark and quiet inside myself. The way you put something in a drawer that you are not ready to deal with yet. And then eventually you stop even looking at the drawer. Yuan knew when we separated. I told her finally after years of not quite finding the words. She held my face in her hands and said, "Ade." I know I have known for a long time. And she wasn't angry. She was sad for a different reason. She was sad that I had carried it alone for so long. I cried harder that day than I had cried in years. So that is who I was. A man learning to live in the open air of his own truth, very slowly, with a 9-year-old boy who loved bass clef mailboxes and had absolutely no filter. I was working at the time as a product liability investigator for a regional consumer safety consulting firm. It's exactly as dry as it sounds. I spent my days reading incident reports, reviewing manufacturing specifications, visiting production facilities, and writing detailed analyses of how and why products had failed in ways that hurt people. It required a methodical mind and a tolerance for paperwork, both of which I had in abundance. I was good at it. I didn't love it exactly, but I found satisfaction in being useful, in making something clearer than it had been before. My office was downtown, on Fayetteville Street, in one of those mid-rise buildings with a lobby that always smelled like industrial cleaner and bad coffee. I took the bus most mornings, which sounds like a small detail but matters in a minute, so I want you to hold on to that. The bus I took ran along South Wilmington Street and turned up West Davie. And I always sat in the third row on the left side, because the window there had a better view of the small community garden that someone had planted in what used to be a vacant lot on the corner. In winter it was bare and brown. In spring it exploded into color in a way that never failed to catch me off guard every single year, no matter how many times I had seen it. I mention the garden because it was where I first noticed that something was alive in me that I had thought was sleeping. I noticed it when I started paying attention to whether or not a certain man was also on the bus. His name I did not know yet, but I had been noticing him for about 3 weeks. He always boarded at the stop near the Boylan Heights crossing, which meant he lived somewhere close to me, which I found unreasonably interesting. He was tall, maybe 6'1", with the kind of posture that suggests someone who spent time outdoors doing something physical. He wore work clothes, not a suit, heavy canvas pants and plain shirts, and sometimes a fleece vest in the cooler mornings. He had a quiet face, not cold but thoughtful. Like a person who was listening to something you couldn't hear. He never looked at his phone. He looked out the window. I told myself I was just observing a fellow commuter. I told myself I was a detail-oriented person by profession, and this was simply an extension of that trait. I told myself many very sensible and completely unconvincing things over those 3 weeks. And then one morning in early October, the bus jolted hard over a crack in the road, and his coffee cup slipped from his hand and rolled down the aisle and stopped right at my feet. He said, "Oh man, I'm sorry," and came down the aisle to retrieve it, and I handed it back to him, and he said, "Thank you," and looked directly at me for the first time. His eyes were the color of cedar wood, dark and warm and with something in them that I can only describe as steadiness, like a compass needle that always finds north. I said, "No damage done." He said, "I'm Ness." He said it like it was short for something, but he didn't elaborate. I said, "Ade." He said, "Nice to meet you, Ade," and went back to his seat. That was it. That was the whole conversation. 4 sentences. And I sat with my hands wrapped around my own coffee cup and felt something shift in my chest, very gently, like a drawer easing open for the first time in years. For the next 2 weeks, we exchanged good mornings. We talked about the weather, about the construction on West Street, about whether the coffee from the cart on Davie was better than the place on Fayetteville. Small talk. Comfortable, careful small talk. The kind that people do when they are interested in each other but haven't quite admitted it yet. I learned that his name was Full Nestor, but almost no one called him that. I learned he was a soil geologist, not for an environmental firm, but specifically for agricultural land assessment, which meant he spent a lot of his time in fields and farms rather than in an office. I learned that he had grown up in Burlington, had lived in Raleigh for 5 years, and had a dog named Clementine who was, by his description, profoundly convinced of her own importance. I told him about Kobe. I told him about the mailbox. He smiled when I said that, a real smile, not polite, not performative, just genuinely delighted, and I thought very quietly, there you are. I did not say that out loud. Obviously, Kobe meanwhile had his own observations. He was a child who missed nothing. He had his mother's instincts and my attention to detail, which is a dangerous combination in a 9-year-old. He had started asking questions about why I seemed, in his words, more awake lately. I told him I had been sleeping better. He did not look convinced. What I didn't know not then was that Kobe had been talking, not to me, to his friends at Daniels Road Elementary, which was his school, a red brick building on the edge of our neighborhood with a good library and a playground that needed new mulch. He had apparently been telling his best friend, a boy named Farrell, and Farrell had told others. And the story had grown in the way that stories do when they travel through the lunch tables of a 4th grade class. I did not know any of this, not until the morning I got the call from the school. The woman who called introduced herself as the principal, Dr. Vonda Hughes. She had a clear, professional voice with a warmth underneath it that you could hear if you were paying attention. She said she was not calling about anything disciplinary. She said Kobe was fine. Then she said, "But I was hoping you might have some time to come in this week and speak with me. There is something I'd like to share with you in person." In person. That phrase did specific things to my heart rate. I went in the next afternoon. The school smelled the way all elementary schools smell. That combination of craft supplies, cafeteria lunch, and the particular wax they use on floors. The secretary showed me to Dr. Hugh's office, which had large windows overlooking the playground and bookshelves, and a desk that was organized but not sterile, the kind of desk that belongs to a person who actually works at it. Dr. Hughes stood to shake my hand. She was a black woman in her early 50s, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the calm, measured presence of someone who had seen a great many things and learned not to be rattled by most of them. She offered me coffee. I accepted, though I barely tasted it. She said, "Mr. Okonkwo, I want you to know this conversation is coming from a place of genuine care for Kobai and for your family." I said, "Thank you." "I appreciate that," she said. "Kobai has been sharing some things with his classmates about your life at home, about you specifically." She paused. "He told several friends that his dad was in love with someone on the bus, that his dad lit up when he talked about this person, that his dad had been happy in a new way." I stared at her. She continued very calmly, "And he mentioned that this person was a man." The room was very quiet. She said, "I want to be clear. Our school has strong values around inclusion and respect, and this information would not change anything about how Kobai is treated here. He is loved by this staff. That is not why I asked you in." I managed to ask, "Then why?" She said, "Because some of the children told their parents, and one of those parents came to me with concerns. Not concerns I share, I want to be clear about that, but concerns that I felt you deserved to know about so you could make informed choices about how you navigate this." She slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a printed email from a parent. It was not cruel, not openly, but it was the kind of careful hostility that hides behind the language of concern. It raised questions about what values were being exposed to children. It asked whether certain discussions were appropriate for elementary school. I read the whole thing. My hands were steady, but only because I was making them be. Dr. Hughes said, "I responded to this parent already. I told her that our school community is built on dignity and inclusion, and that her child would continue to receive every support we offer, as would yours." I did not engage with the premise of her concern. I looked up from the paper. She looked directly at me and said, "I called you in because you deserve to know. And because, honestly, I wanted to tell you in person that I think it's wonderful when a parent is happy, whatever that looks like." I did not expect that. I was not prepared for that. I said, "I don't know if I'm in love. I don't know what I am. It's complicated." She smiled just slightly. "It usually is." I drove home in a state that I can only describe as vertigo. Not fear exactly. Not shame the way there might have been once years ago when I was younger and less sure of myself. Something more complicated. I felt exposed. I felt seen, in a way I hadn't prepared for, by my 9-year-old son of all people, who had looked at his father and seen something true before his father had fully admitted it. And under all of that, running like a current beneath the surface of everything else, was the realization that I had just been told by a school principal in an elementary school office. That my son believed I was in love. And my son, who was 9 and had no filter and saw everything, was not wrong. That night I sat on the back porch while Kobai did his homework at the kitchen table inside. I could see him through the sliding glass door, chewing on his pencil, completely absorbed in whatever math problem had captured his attention. I thought about how much of my life I had spent being absorbed in the wrong things, being careful about the wrong things, protecting myself from the wrong risks. I texted Nestor that evening. We had exchanged numbers the previous week, very casually, in the context of coordinating about a neighborhood cleanup event that neither of us had actually attended. I typed and deleted 3 different messages before I settled on something simple. I said, "Hey, are you free this weekend? I'd like to grab coffee somewhere that isn't a bus." I put the phone face down on the porch railing and looked up at the sky. The oak trees moved in the wind. Somewhere down the street, a neighbor's wind chime played its small, uncertain song. My phone lit up. He said, "I've been hoping you'd ask." And then I did something I hadn't done in a very long time, alone on my back porch. With the night air cool around me, and the light from my son's homework lamp glowing through the glass. I laughed, really laughed, from somewhere low and honest in my chest. I didn't know yet that asking Nestor for coffee would change the entire direction of my life. I didn't know that the most important conversations were still ahead of me. I didn't know that before anything real could begin, I would have to look at myself with complete honesty and do some things that were hard and necessary and long overdue. But I laughed. And that felt like the beginning of something. The coffee shop I suggested was called Jubilee Press, on Glenwood South, in a building that had once been a print shop and still had the old letterpress frames mounted on the brick walls like art. It was busy on Saturday mornings, but not overwhelming. The kind of place where you could have a real conversation without raising your voice and without feeling like anyone was listening. I arrived 7 minutes early, which is just who I am. Nestor arrived 3 minutes after me, exactly on time, which I noted and found reassuring in a way I couldn't quite explain. He was wearing a dark green flannel shirt and had clearly just come from being outside. There was a bit of wind color in his face, and he smelled like cold air and cedar. Which is an absurd thing to notice, and I noticed it completely. He ordered a black coffee. I ordered mine with oat milk, and he looked at me with mild amusement, and I said, "Don't." He said, "I wasn't going to say anything." I said, "You were thinking it." He said, "I was thinking it," and smiled, and that was the tone of the whole morning. We talked for 2 hours, not about anything life-changing at first, just about the ordinary things that tell you who a person is when they're not trying to perform for you. He told me about the farmland assessments he'd been doing out near Johnston County, about the particular satisfaction of pulling a soil core and reading it like a sentence in a language most people don't know exists. I told him about the product liability cases, about the strange grammar of manufacturing failure, about how sometimes what breaks is exactly what was never designed to bend. He said, "That's a good way to put it." I said, "Which part?" He said, "The part about things that were never designed to bend." There was a pause then, the kind that has a lot of weight in it. I said, "I should tell you something." He set down his coffee and gave me his full attention. That quality of his, the fullness of his attention when he chose to give it, was something I had noticed on the bus and found again here, confirmed and deepened. I said, "I was married to a woman. For 8 years. We separated 3 years ago and were genuinely okay. She and I were friends. We co-parent our son. But I want to be honest with you about where I'm coming from, because I don't think I've always been as honest about myself as I should have been. And I'm trying to change that." He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Thank you for telling me." I said, "I'm not entirely sure what I'm doing here. I mean, I know what I'm doing here. But I haven't done this before in terms of being open about it, and I'm probably going to be clumsy about some things." He said, "I've been clumsy about a lot of things." I think clumsy is underrated. I laughed at that. He said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Please." He said, "What finally made you reach out? You could have kept doing the bus thing indefinitely." I considered how much to say. Then I decided that the whole point of this conversation was honesty, so I told him about Dr. Hughes. I told him about the email, about the parents' complaint, about Kobai apparently announcing to his 4th grade lunch table that his dad was in love. I watched Nestor's face while I told it, and he didn't flinch or pull back. His expression moved through something close to tenderness. He said, "Your son sounds like someone worth knowing." I said, "He is. He is absolutely someone worth knowing." We walked after coffee, down Glenwood, and then through Pullen Park, where the leaves were mid-fall, and that particular Raleigh October light was doing what it does, turning everything gold and slightly unreal. We talked the whole time, about our families, about growing up, about the particular silence that forms around some kinds of truth when you're young and don't have a name for yourself yet. He told me he'd come out to his family at 25, that his mother had cried, but not for the reason he feared. She had cried because she'd been waiting for him to trust her enough to say it. And the waiting had been hard. He told me he had been in one serious relationship, 4 years, that ended without cruelty but with grief. Because the man he'd loved had moved for a career opportunity, and neither of them had been willing to ask the other to give something up. He said it simply and without bitterness, and I respected that. I said, "What do you want now? In life, I mean, if you're willing to say." He was quiet for a moment. We were standing near the edge of the park by the creek, and the water was low and clear, and a pair of ducks were arguing quietly about something in the reeds. He said, "I want something that's honest. I want to feel at home in my life. I've been doing all right on my own, but doing all right is different from feeling like you're where you're supposed to be." I said, "Yes, it is very different." He looked at me. Not the way people look at each other when they are trying to impress each other, but the way people look at each other when they are simply looking. He said, "I like you, Ade. I'm going to be direct about that. But I also think you've got some things to work through on your own terms, and I'd rather take this slowly than rush something and watch it break." I said, "That is exactly the right thing to say." He said, "I have my moments." We walked back to where we had each parked. And we said goodbye the way people say goodbye when they are being careful with something new and not yet sure of its shape. He said he'd like to do this again. I said I would too. And then he drove away in a truck that had seen better days, but was clearly well maintained, which told me something about him that I added to everything else I was learning. I sat in my car for a few minutes before I started it. I was trying to hold everything still, the morning, the conversation, the feeling in my chest that was somewhere between hope and terror. But there was something underneath all of that, something I had been pushing to the side, that I knew I needed to attend to before any of this could properly begin. And that something had a name. I needed to talk to Kobai. I also needed to talk to Yuend, and I needed to talk to Dr. Hughes again, not because I owed her anything, but because she had done me a kindness and I didn't want to leave that floating. I started with Yuend. I called her that afternoon while Kobai was at her place for the weekend. I said I needed to talk. She said, "I know, Kobai's already filled me in his way." There was a smile in her voice. I asked if I could come over, and she said yes. Yuen's apartment was in Cameron Village, about 10 minutes from my house. It was small and warm and full of the things she loved: framed prints, overflowing bookshelves, a kitchen that always smelled like whatever she was cooking, which that afternoon was groundnut soup. And the smell of it hit me like a memory when she opened the door. We sat at her kitchen table. She had made tea for both of us without asking whether I wanted it, which was a very Yuen thing to do. I said, "Kobai told his class about me," she said. "He told his class you were happy." In his mind, that was the important part. I said, "Someone made a complaint to the school." She said, "I know." She wrapped her hands around her mug. "How do you feel?" I said. "I feel like I want to do this right for him. I don't want him carrying things that are mine to carry." She said, "Then you talk to him, clearly and simply. The way you always talk to him when it matters." She paused. "He loves you, Ade. He's proud of you. That's not a burden. That's him telling the world his father is someone worth celebrating." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "I started something with someone very slowly." "I wanted you to know." She said, "Good, just that, good. Tell me something about him." I said, "He's a soil geologist. He has a dog named Clementine who thinks she's in charge." She said, "I like him already." I laughed, and she laughed too. And for a moment, the kitchen felt like something I had always hoped. We could become on the other side of grief. I said, "Thank you for how you've handled all of this for the last 3 years, for today." She said, "We were good to each other when it counted. That's worth something." It was worth everything. I want to be clear about that. That evening I came to pick up Kobai, and after dinner, after the dishes, after his bath, after the reading time, I sat on the edge of his bed while he was settled in, and I said, "Hey, I want to talk to you about something." He said, "Is it about Nestor?" Of course, he already knew the name, of course. I said, "Did you tell your friends about me?" He looked at me with 9-year-old seriousness and said, "I told Farrell you were happy because of someone on the bus." I didn't say anything bad. I said, "I know you didn't say anything bad, but I found out today that some of the parents heard about it and one of them was unkind about it." His face changed. Not fear, more like the particular focused indignation that children feel when something they know to be simple turns out to have complications. He said, "Why would anyone be unkind about you being happy?" I said, "Some people are unkind about dads who like other men. You know that we've talked about that." He thought about it. He said, "I know, I just forget sometimes because it seems so dumb." I said, "It is a little. But it's real, And I want you to know that if anyone says something to you about it, you don't have to argue. You can come to me. He said, I know. Then after a pause, are you going to keep seeing Nestor? I said, we're getting to know each other, slowly. Nothing is happening overnight. He said, okay. And then like it was the most natural thing in the world, he seems nice from what you said. I said, he is, I think. I'm still figuring that out. Kobai said, Dad. I said, yeah. He said, I'm glad you're happy. And I held that. I held it the way you hold something that you know you'll be carrying with you for the rest of your life. I kissed his forehead and turned off the light and stood in the hallway outside his door for a moment in the dark, just breathing. The next morning I went back to Daniels Road. Dr. Hughes was in her office. Her assistant let me in without an appointment, which told me something about how she ran things. I sat across from her again and said, I wanted to say thank you. For how you handled that, you didn't have to be kind, you chose to be. She looked at me over the rims of her glasses and said, Of course I did. That's the job. Then she added more quietly, and it's the right thing. Those are the same thing in my office. I said, Kobai's a good kid. She said, he's a great kid. He talks about you all the time. That tells me everything I need to know about what you're doing at home. I left the school that morning feeling lighter than I had in a very long time. Not because the hard things were over. They weren't. The parent who had complained was still out there. There would be other moments like that, I knew it. Other moments where the world made my son feel like his family was somehow less than. Those moments don't disappear. You just learn to face them with more clarity. But something had changed in me. Some door that had been almost closed was now almost open. And I found, standing on the sidewalk outside Kobai's school in the mid-October light, that I was not afraid of what was on the other side of it. I was curious. That is the best word I have for what I was. I texted Nestor. I said, I'd like to have you over for dinner sometime, not yet. But eventually, he said, I'd like that too. I said, Kobai already knows your name. There was a long pause, and then he said, I hope that's okay. I said, more than okay, what I didn't say. Because it was still too early and too new and too fragile. Was that something in me was certain about him in a way I had never let myself be certain about anything that mattered to my own heart. I had spent so long being certain about logistics and schedules and safety plans. I had never let that certainty extend to something as vulnerable as wanting. But I was learning. And the learning was beginning to feel like something I could trust. I didn't know then that in a few months' time, the parent who had sent that email would do something that would force me to make a very public choice. I didn't know that Kobai would face a hard afternoon at school and come home quieter than usual. And that the way I responded to that afternoon would say something essential about the kind of man I was becoming. I didn't know that Nestor would show up at my door one January evening with a bag of groceries and no agenda, and that meal, that quiet, ordinary meal, would be the moment I understood what it felt like to not be outside of my own life anymore. I didn't know any of that, but I was beginning to trust that I would be ready for it when it came. January in Raleigh is a subtle month. People from other parts of the country sometimes expect southern winters to be mild, and in terms of snow they usually are, but the cold has its own quality here. It's a damp cold, the kind that finds its way through walls and windows and wool sweaters. The city quiets down, the streets feel slower. And in that particular January, I noticed that the quiet didn't feel empty to me anymore. It felt like space. Nestor and I had spent the fall learning each other. That's the best way I know to put it. We met for coffee, for walks, for one afternoon at the NC Museum of Natural Sciences, where he spent 45 minutes explaining a fossil display to me with a level of enthusiasm that I found completely endearing. We texted in the evenings, sometimes about nothing, which is its own kind of language. We were careful with each other in a way that felt less like caution and more like care, the way you carry something you have decided matters to you. We had not rushed anything. We had not tried to skip steps. And I want to say clearly, in case you're wondering, that the slowness was mutual and genuine and chosen with full awareness on both sides. We were adults who had both lived enough to know the difference between excitement and readiness, and we were committed to being ready. But there was a moment in November, after one of our evening walks through the neighborhood, when we were standing on my front porch and the light was on inside, and you could see through the window that Kobai had left his soccer cleats in the middle of the living room floor again. And Nestor said, I want to tell you something. I said, okay. He said, I know we're taking this slow. And I want to keep doing that. But I also want you to know that I haven't felt this way in a long time. I didn't want to not say it. I thought you should know. I said, I know. Me too, he nodded once like that settled something. I said, I also want you to know that whatever this is, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not someone who starts things and lets them drift. He said, I know that about you already. And then he said goodnight and walked to his truck and drove away. And I stood on the porch in the November cold and thought, this is real. This is a real thing happening to me, right now. The situation with the parent from the school had not resolved itself quietly the way I had hoped. Her name I won't use. But she had continued to make noise to other parents, to other community members. And she had, in December, raised the issue at a school board meeting in a way that was just on this side of coded. She did not name my son. She did not name me. But she talked about age-appropriate values and what children should be exposed to, and anyone who knew the context understood exactly what she was talking about. Dr. Hughes handled it with precision and grace. She spoke at that same meeting, calmly and on the record, about the school's commitment to every student, and she did it without dramatics and without any wavering at all. I watched it on the recorded video the school district posted, and I found her extraordinary. Kobai had had one hard afternoon in early December. He had come home quieter than usual, hadn't said much at dinner, picked at his food. I had waited because he is a child who needs a little time before he can talk about the things that bother him. At bedtime, he told me that a boy in his class had said something to him on the playground, something about his dad. He didn't tell me exactly what was said, but I got enough of the picture. I asked him how he felt. He thought about it for a moment with that particular Kobai seriousness and said, mostly I just felt like punching him. I said, that's a very understandable feeling. He said, I didn't. I said, I know you didn't. I'm proud of you, he said, but I also felt embarrassed, not because of you, because he made it sound like something to be embarrassed about, and for a second I almost let him. That sentence. That sentence from my 9-year-old. I had to work very hard to keep my face steady. I said, the fact that you caught that, the fact that you noticed that he was trying to make you feel something that wasn't true, that's a remarkable thing, Kobai. That is a genuinely remarkable thing. He said, I know. Then, with complete composure, can you sign my reading log? Children are miraculous. I had a harder conversation with myself that night, alone in my room, sitting on the edge of the bed with the lamp on. I thought about that word Kobai had said, embarrassed. I thought about the years I had spent managing exactly that feeling, carrying it around, keeping things hidden so that the feeling would stay manageable. And I thought about my son, 9 years old, catching himself almost believing a lie about his own family and choosing not to. He was braver than I had been at twice his age. I decided something that night. I decided that I was done being hidden. Not recklessly, not in a way that made Kobai a symbol or a cause that was not fair to him, but in a way that was simply honest. In my daily life, in my community, in the way I held myself in the world, it felt like putting down something very heavy. In January, Nestor came for dinner. This was the evening I told you about earlier. He showed up at my door at 6 o'clock with a bag of groceries and said, I thought I'd cook if that's all right. I've been meaning to make this for weeks and I keep not doing it. I said, what is it? He said, jerk chicken. My grandmother's recipe, which she got from her grandmother, which at this point is older than anyone can accurately trace. I stepped back and let him into my kitchen. Kobai was doing homework at the table and looked up when Nestor came in and said with great ceremony, Are you Nestor? Nestor said, I am. Are you Kobai? Kobai said, yes. And then, because he is who he is, my dad talks about you. Nestor looked at me over the top of Kobai's head with an expression that said, he is exactly what I expected, and I mouthed, I'm sorry, and he mouthed, no, you're not, and both of those things were true. The evening was easy. That's what I want to tell you. It was not dramatic, it was not a turning point the way turning points look in movies. It was just easy. Nestor cooked, and the apartment filled with the smell of allspice and Scotch bonnet and thyme. And Kobai finished his homework, and then sat at the counter asking Nestor questions about soil with the same focused curiosity he brought to everything. At one point he asked, very seriously, whether there was soil in space. and Nestor said that actually it was a great question, and proceeded to explain the difference between soil and regolith in terms that a 9-year-old could follow, and Kobai was completely absorbed. I stood to the side and watched, and felt something that I want to try to name accurately because it matters. It was not completion. I don't think love works the way that word suggests, as if there is a missing piece that another person fills in. What I felt was more like recognition. Like arriving at a place you have never been before and finding that something in your body already knows it. Like looking at your actual life and not the slightly altered version of it you have been living and being not afraid. We ate together. Kobai declared the jerk chicken the best thing he had ever eaten in his life, which is exactly the kind of wholehearted statement he makes about things he means, and Nestor looked quietly pleased. After dinner, Kobai went to bed without too much negotiation, which may have been some kind of record, and Nestor and I sat at the kitchen table with the remnants of the meal and talked. We talked for a long time, about nothing urgent, about everything important, about how strange and good it was to be sitting here in my kitchen in this life in January after everything. At one point I said, I keep waiting for this to be more complicated than it feels. He said, maybe it doesn't have to be. I said, I've been complicated for a long time. I'm not sure I know how to do simple. He said, I don't think it's simple, I think it's just honest. That landed somewhere deep. I said, I want to say something, and I want to say it without it being too much pressure because we're still learning each other and I believe in that process. He said, say it. I said, I am falling in love with you. I don't know what the timeline looks like. I don't know what the shape of this is yet, but I feel that. I wanted you to know I feel that. He was quiet for a moment, not a retreating quiet. A receiving quiet. He said, I feel that too. I have been feeling it for a while. I said, okay. He said, okay. The wind chimed down the street, played its small song through the winter air. The lamp on the counter made everything gold. The dishes were in the drying rack, and Clementine, who had been in the truck, and whom Nestor had brought in after dinner at Kobai's enthusiastic insistence, was asleep under the kitchen table like she owned the floor. It was an ordinary evening, a Tuesday in January in Raleigh, North Carolina, in a craftsman bungalow with green shutters and a bass clef mailbox leaning slightly to the left. Nothing about it looked like a milestone from the outside, but I knew. Spring came the way spring always does in Raleigh, fast and without much warning. 1 week of rain, and then suddenly everything alive at once. The dogwoods and the Bradford pears and the azaleas all competing for attention. The community garden on West Davie exploded into color the way it always did. And when I passed it on the bus one morning, I caught myself smiling before I even understood why. The situation with the school had fully settled. The parent who had complained had not, as far as anyone knew, continued to pursue it after the school board meeting. Dr. Hughes had made the school's position clear, and it had held. Kobai's class had moved through winter and into spring with the ordinary drama of 4th grade. Spelling tests and book report due dates, and the eternal question of who was going to be whose partner on the field trip. The boy who had said something unkind on the playground had not repeated it. Kobai, to his credit, had not made it a war. He had simply gone on being himself, which is the most effective response to almost everything. Yuan and I had dinner together in March, the three of us, which had become our rhythm on Sunday evenings. She asked about Nestor with genuine interest, and I told her things were good, that we were taking it at the pace that felt right. She said, you seem like yourself again. The version of yourself I always knew was in there. I said, I feel like that. She said, good, and she meant it completely. Nestor and I had begun building a life in the way that lives are built, not in grand gestures, but in accumulated ordinary moments. Saturday mornings with Clementine in Pullen Park. Evenings where he came over and I cooked, because it turned out we both loved to cook and had no interest in making it a competition. Sunday afternoons where we drove out toward Johnston County, so he could check on field work, and I sat on the tailgate of his truck reading while he disappeared into the rows and came back with his boots covered in the specific red clay of Wake County soil. He came to Kobai's school play in April. Kobai played a talking oak tree, which the drama teacher had written specifically with Kobai's voice in mind. And he had 3 lines, and delivered them with profound solemnity that made the whole audience laugh, and Nestor and I laughed the hardest. After, in the school parking lot, Kobai had a brief conversation with Farrell's parents that I was not close enough to fully hear. But I saw Farrell's dad shake Nestor's hand and Farrell's mom give me a hug and say something warm, and I thought, this is what it looks like when community works. This is what it looks like when people choose to be neighbors in the full meaning of that word. Not everyone had chosen that. I was not naive. But enough people had that the weight of the ones who hadn't felt bearable. There was one more thing I wanted to do, and I did it in May. I went back to Dr. Hughes. Not because anything was wrong, but because I had been carrying a gratitude I hadn't fully expressed. I sat across from her for the third time in that office with the big windows and the organized desk, and I said, I wanted to update you. Things are going well. Kobai is good. I am good, she said. I can see that. She was looking at me with that same steady warmth. You look different than you did in October. I said, I feel different. She said, what changed? I said, I stopped waiting for it to be safe. I realized it was already happening whether I was ready or not, and I had a choice about how to meet it. She said, that's wisdom. I said, my 9-year-old taught it to me. She laughed at that. A genuine, full laugh, the kind I suspected she didn't let out in this office very often. I thanked her again. She walked me to the door herself, which she didn't have to do, and she said, you tell Kobai we're rooting for him. I said, he knows. I walked out into a May morning that smelled like cut grass and rain, and the particular electric freshness that comes after everything has come back alive. I called Nestor on the walk to my car, just to hear his voice, and he answered on the second ring like he always did, like he was always slightly waiting for me without making a point of it. I told him what Dr. Hughes had said. He said, she sounds like a good person. I said, she is, she's really good. He said, come for a drive this weekend. I want to show you a piece of land out near Smithfield. The soil profile is extraordinary, which I know sounds like the most boring sentence you've ever heard. I said, it doesn't sound boring. He said, no, I said. Not when you say it. There was a small, warm silence on the line. He said, I love you, Ade. I've been wanting to say the full version of that for a while. I stood still on the sidewalk outside Daniels Road Elementary in the May morning sunshine and understood, fully and without reservation, what it meant to be arrived. I said, I love you too, Ness, the full version. Clementine barked in the background, apparently affronted by being left out of the moment. I drove home through Boylan Heights with the windows down, and the spring air coming through and the oak trees bright and green above the streets. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment and looked at my house, the dark green shutters. The bass clef mailbox, leaning its familiar lean to the left, paint faded at the edges. Chosen by a 6-year-old who had grown into a 9-year-old, who loved his father with a completeness that expected nothing in return. I thought about the drawer inside myself that I had kept closed for so long. I thought about what it had cost to keep it closed, and what it had felt like to finally open it and what I had found inside. Not something broken, not something that needed to be fixed. Just something that had been waiting, patiently in the dark, for the moment when I was finally brave enough to hold it in the light. A school principal had called me in over a piece of paper and offered me kindness I hadn't asked for. A 9-year-old had looked at his father and seen love before his father had admitted it. A man on a bus had dropped his coffee cup and looked at me with